Okay, so this meeting is being live streamed. That means it's going to be saved. So, good evening. Good evening. It is July the 31st, 2022. And I'm sharing the screen. I got to pause this one right now because, okay, pause it. There we go. I don't want the feedback. And I need to come back here and find out. I was going to watch Washington Journal. Where is it? Here, not there. Nope, not in Nevada Ledge. No, not that either. No, I think that's me. I gotta go back wherever I was. There it is, right there. There we go. And we're live. So let's just talk about No Child Left Behind legislation that happened so long ago, but people really don't understand the impact of public education and the choices that were made and how we're supposed to be making progress. So shall we listen up?
Attention Medicare recipients. The Inogen One portable oxygen concentrator may now be available at little or no
public opinion strategies. Thanks to both of you for joining us in our conversations this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Lauren.
Ahead here on Washington Journal, our landmark legislation series continues with a look at the 2002 No Child Left Behind law, the discussion with Frederick Hess of the American Enterprise Institute and Carolyn Heinrich, a professor at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. Right now, check out this clip from Republican John Boehner and Democrat George Miller on this show back in December 2001 as the House was getting ready to consider the No Child Left Behind Act. Here it is.
What's in this legislation?
Well, two things are in this legislation. The money, if you will, to help school districts and states try to address the problems of educating poor and minority children in this country. And then some very serious rules on accountability about how you will spend that money and the results that we expect from the expenditure of that money. And that's very different from the way we've run this program over the last 30 years. In 1965, President Johnson, of course, part of the war on poverty, wanted to address the issue of the education of poor children in this country, which was the right thing to do, and it is today, and put a lot of money on the table. But we never really got around to the second part of the equation, which was the education of the children. The intent of the act was to close the gap between rich and poor children, majority and minority children. And that gap really has not in any significant way closed in terms of educational achievement. This bill will measure whether or not school districts and states, in fact, close that gap between those two groups of children.
Congressman Bader, how do you test accountability? How do you make sure that school districts are doing what you here in Washington say they should be doing? And at what point does it become too much Washington control and too little local control?
Well, that was the delicate balance that we had to find as we moved this legislation through. And the president started this in a campaign last year, and his first full day in office had us to the White House to push this proposal of requiring testing in grades 3 through 8 in reading and math, making sure that those test scores and that information was public data for parents, community leaders, school board members, and to make sure that the information was disaggregated by school building and by subgroup. White students, minority students, low-income students, disabled students, so that people would really see what was happening in their own local schools. It wouldn't surprise you that 80% of parents with school-age children think their kids go to great schools. Well, they don't. And this, for the first time, I think we will have objective data by which to help children who need help, to help principals and teachers in terms of identifying where the problems are. Is it the curriculum? Is it the teacher? Is it the system they're using? This information, I think, is the most critical part of the bill, because long term, it's empowering people to take action in their own communities.
And that was Republican John Boehner and Democrat George Miller of California on this show back in December 2001 as the House was getting set to take up and pass the No Child Left Behind Act. It was President George W. Bush's first signature educational and primary signature educational policy achievement, one that changed the federal role in public education, but was ultimately rolled back. And here on...
Okay, so they think because they rolled it back that there's no further requirement to meet those standards, and that's just not true. The reality is that you have the right to meet the standards of what public education offers, and you have to fight that battle. So even if they're rolling it back at the state level, doesn't mean that they actually rolled anything back, because the law is just the law.
Our legislative series. Joining us this morning, this last hour, we're joined by Carolyn Heinrich, who's a professor of leadership and policy at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College, and Rick Hess, who's education policy and studies director at the American Enterprise Institute. And to both of you, how does this legislation, the No Child Left Behind law, fit into the category of landmark legislation? Carolyn Heinrich, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, it was a very important law because it really shaped educational practice at many levels. And I mean, it was a law that had, came out of, I think, work that was already being done in the state to try to reckon with the fact that when we looked at our students' performance, we were not measuring up to our peers in other developed countries. And there was a lot of concern, particularly about some groups falling further behind. And so not only at the federal level, but states had already been looking at things we could do to change the circumstances. And so, a lot of, as we know, George W. Bush was president, and much of what came to be a part of No Child Left Behind reflected things that were being done in Texas and as well as in other places. And it really did, in fact, for more than a decade, shape what was happening at the local level.
And Rick has George W. Bush ran, as part of his platform, ran on passing a law like this No Child Left Behind. Obviously, changes happened to the law. We'll get into that some, but tell us about how it was received at the time in terms of the policy changes it made.
Sure. It was modeled on what they did in Texas. This was a bipartisan effort over about 10 or 12 years. No Child Left Behind was really, you can think of it as kind of the high point of this school reform coalition that took shape in the early 80s with the launch of the Nation at Risk under the Reagan White House, really came to fruition in the Clinton and Bush and Obama years, and has since largely unraveled. No Child Left Behind, we did a lot of different stuff. I mean, it's one of the big, fat Washington laws, runs hundreds of pages. But it did three main things. Back in the late 60s, after, in that, you had that initial little clip of Miller and Boehner talking about the law at the time, they referenced Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society.
Right.
Back in the late 60s, Robert Kennedy, then a senator from New York, asked the Commissioner of Education, Francis Keppel, hey, how are we going to know if this stuff's doing any good? And Keppel kind of shrugged and said, we don't really have any way to know. So the big and most important thing No Child Left Behind did was it said that if states wanted their Title I federal education dollars, they had to have standards and test kids regularly in grades 3 to 8 in reading and math, and once in elementary, middle school, and high school in science. And they had to report this information. This is, for instance, today, why we know some of the consequences that the school closures during COVID had. Absent this kind of testing, we'd be waving our hands. It also did two other really big things that were much more problematic. One, it required states to say whether schools were making what they called adequate yearly progress, whether they were doing okay. And if they failed to make AYP, adequate yearly progress, the third thing it did was it came up with a federal string of intervention, a remedy cascade.
Yes, that's right.
That states had to do to schools. Problem was there was little evidence that we knew whether any of this would actually work, and it created a bunch of problems. But that transparency that NCLB created was hugely significant and still is 20 years on.
So, Caroline Heinrich, what do you think the No Child Left Behind Act got right? What do you think? Where do you think it went wrong?
Yeah, I think Rick made a really important point in that the test-based accountability, as we describe it, was really a central part of the law. So, requiring us to test students from 3rd to 8th grade, and then at least once in high school, did give us really important information on how kids were doing. Another really important part of that was to also look at how particular subgroups of children who we are most concerned were being left behind, right? Part of the name of the law, were doing relative to their peers, and to ensure that we were working hard to invest resources in helping those students who are most behind, catch up to their peers or meet the standards that were being set. So, that is, as Rick mentioned, an important part that continues on into, educational practice and policy today. However, Rick alluded to the fact that there were things that didn't go well. And he pointed out, for example, that, this system created essentially specific measures for us to judge whether or not students were making adequate yearly progress. And this was defined by proficiency rates. And so the federal government had set targets for achieving proficiency that moved each year. Although the other kind of complicated part of it was that states, started in different places with their own benchmarking of where they were relative to those progress, how that actually turned into standards within each state for schools and students to meet. But the remedies, so for example, Rick mentioned that, so if a school for at least 3 years in a row failed to make adequate yearly progress, then these consequences, the federal interventions that were required, had to be implemented. And there were essentially 2 main things that those schools were required to do. So they could give the students in the schools that were identified as not making adequate progress, those students could either choose to go to another school within the district, and so they may have to be bused to another better school, or they could receive what was called supplemental educational services. And those services were essentially very much like tutoring, but they had to be outside of school, and were required, with the exception of some waivers, to be provided by providers. They could be, nonprofit, for-profit providers outside of the school system itself. The idea was, if the schools are failing the students during the day, why would they do better in providing them these supplemental educational services? And so schools and states were expected to, in a sense, manage this market for how services would be delivered. And it ended up being far more complicated and requiring a lot more capacity than schools and states had time or resource to invest in. And so there was a lot of, a lot of practices that were, I think, ineffective, and also for some of the biggest school districts. And I was actually studying this in the field with some of the biggest school districts in the nation when it was happening. Some of those school districts were overwhelmed each year. More and more of their schools came to these consequences. And, so they had Title I fund budgets that didn't have enough in them to spread those resources out so kids got enough of those tutoring hours or supplemental educational services. And it depended on what providers charged. The market had wide-ranging types of providers. It wasn't well monitored. It was supposed to be monitored by states. States were supposed to be identifying which providers, with the schools, which providers were effective and which were not, but there really wasn't capacity or system set up to do that. So we did some of that work funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, and found it to be really reflect what we see and often in our markets, in that there are some providers doing really well, some doing poorly, but school districts without additional support were having a hard time vetting them and actually making the system work well for kids. And
yeah, you can go ahead. Here on Washington Journal, we are doing our last of our landmark legislation series here on this Sunday morning. We're talking about the No Child Left Behind Act, which was signed into law in 2002. Our guests are Carolyn Heinrich. She's a professor at the Vanderbilt University's Peabody College in Nashville, and Rick Hess, who is the Education Policy Studies Director at the American Enterprise Institute. And we want to remind our viewers and listeners too of the process of this law in terms of it came into effect, as we mentioned, signed by President Bush in 2002, was approved by the House and Senate late in December of 2001. It's legislation that established national standardized testing requirements for federally funded schools. It defined ways schools could improve the educational experience. It established mechanisms to improve low-performing schools, and students at low-performing schools were allowed to transfer to other schools. It also established new standards for teachers. What do you think, both of you? I'll start, Rick Hess. What do you think the legacy of the NLCB is?
I think it's big. It really is a landmark law in a couple ways. One, it really marked a shift in the Republican Party. It was part of the intra-GOP debate that's playing out even today between, say, the Trump wing and the Mitt Romney wing of the party. It was very much in evidence. No Child Left Behind is a law that Bill Clinton wanted to pass. In 1994, Clinton proposed having states test kids once in elementary, once in middle, once in high school in reading and math. And he got so much blowback from the education establishment, from the unions, that they wound up doing something called the Improving America Schools Act, which is voluntary money, and states could opt in. And all the states took the money, and then only like 11 states did what they promised. So by the time you get to 2001, you actually had huge frustration on the left in the form of Ted Kennedy, and George Miller, who were saying, look, we're not sure that these federal dollars are actually making a difference for poor kids. And they really wanted Washington to step up.
No accountability.
And on the right, George Bush had run in 2000 on this program of compassionate conservatism. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the Republicans really needed to do by the end of the 90s was reposition the party by trying to convince the American middle that they were sincere about opportunity, that it just wasn't lip service. And so what you had was this real meeting of minds. On the left, it was folks like Ted Kennedy standing up to the education establishment and the union. On the right, it was Bush inviting Washington into education policy.
Yeah, it was the federal government against the state policy.
Embracing policy that, as Carolyn mentioned, was explicitly race-based in the way it would break out subgroups and the way it was tracking whether or not.
That didn't make a difference. What made a difference is who was ensuring adequate access for all the children. And those people who were standing up are the ones that got the benefits. And those who just never were heard, well, they didn't get anything. So let's just listen a little bit. See, it's all by the perception, but the law is the law. And the federal law says the law says what it is.
Schools are performing. And it really set this expectation that Washington was going to tell states, you have to have standards, you have to score schools. Now, as this played out over the next 8 or 10 years, because the law was kind of spasmodically designed, it's good to take a snapshot of where kids are. But part of the law said that 100% of American kids would be proficient by 2014. Now, that's kind of like saying we're going to eliminate 100% of American crime by 2028. It's not a serious legislative goal. It's an aspiration. And so the closer you got to 2014, the more and more schools were identified as failing. So by 2010, 2011, well over half of the nation's schools were labeled failing under No Child Left Behind. So then were identified for these remedies with all the problems that ensued. And so one of the things that happened was the moment of bipartisan agreement that gave us No Child Left Behind with 89 votes in the U.S. Senate and almost 400 votes in the House, wound up giving rise to a bipartisan backlash against federal leadership on education, frustration on both the right and the left. So the legacy of NCLB, it both shows the ways in which we have set a new platform for federal involvement in K-12, this transparency around achievement testing, the notion that there is a significant federal role. But it also set the table for so much of the blowback we saw against Common Core, frustration about federal intervention in education, what became the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015 and the effort to dial back NCLB. So in a lot of ways, when we talk about education policy in America today, we're still living in the world that NCLB created.
And we'll talk about the follow-on legislation, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and during the Obama administration. Well, let's hear from our callers. 202-748-8000 is the line for those of you in the East and Central time zones. It's 202-748-8001 for Mountain and Pacific. And just another throwback here, let's listen to the words of then President George W. Bush on the day of the signing of the legislation in January 2002, talking about transparency in education. Here's what he said.
What did he say?
If we want to make sure no child is left behind, every child must learn to read. And every child must learn to add and subtract.
Amen. Every child. You hear him. Right there with him. He said,
In return for federal dollars,
in return for the federal
we're
money.
asking states
That's what we're asking.
to design accountability systems to show parents and teachers whether or not children can read and write and add and subtract in grades 3 through 8. The fundamental principle of this bill is that every child can learn. We expect every child to learn, and you must show us whether or not every child is learning.
Carolyn Heinrich, how did states do in that in responding to the president's call there in return for federal dollars? You've got to do all of these things.
That's right.
Yeah, well, I think states in some of the research bears this out. So states did take on the responsibilities, but a lot of, for example, determining how it would be implemented, determining what the standards within states would be, how, were they going to help school districts move toward the proficiency standards that were set at the federal level. As Rick mentioned, there was essentially an impossible standard set where everybody was supposed to be proficient by 2014. But I think the research points to the fact that there was additional state and local spending that was spurred by the law, and there was, for example, there were more investments in trying to retain quality teachers, and of course there was the whole investment in the infrastructure needed for the systematic testing of students. But I think it's also been well documented that in some respects, it was interpreted as an underfunded mandate. The money that had to be used for implementation came from Title I. Title I money, might be taken from other purposes. And as Rick mentioned, over time, as more and more schools, as those standards ratcheted up, became subject to the consequences, the federal interventions that were supposed to implement, it became unsustainable. And that's when we saw school districts and states requesting waivers from those provisions, as more and more schools came under the responsibility for, providing their supplemental services or transfers, it just wasn't working. The other thing that is pretty well documented is that, this is something that's not specific to education, but when you set a target, people do everything possible to reach it, regardless of whether it's actually bringing about the kind of change we want. So sometimes it's called hitting the target, but missing the point. And I think that started to happen under the test-based accountability system. We saw, for example, systematic cheating to achieve the standards. We saw, also perversions in the delivery of the interventions. For example, I was in Texas for part of the time and worked with the state legislature because there were providers of supplemental educational services that were going around signing up parents to give their students these services and then never delivering the services. And there weren't provisions to hold those providers accountable, or they weren't actually there weren't the resources to fully monitor this expansive market. And so, and there were a number of ways in which it kind of started to unravel, and it wasn't doing what we had hoped it would do. And I think it's also important to point out that test-based accountability has been somewhat controversial, as Rick pointed out. But I think part of that relates to how we use that information when students are being tested, and this is in two particular subjects, specific, math and reading that were, which we were held accountable, schools were held accountable under No Child Left Behind. They start to do everything they can to make sure they're achieving those, harder and harder to reach standards. And so that's where when it's used and people feel like it's out of their control to reach it, that's when, we see that kind of breakdown
And
where gaining of the standards.
13 years after the law bill was signed into law, the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed. We'll talk about that in a minute. I want to talk both about what the education scene was like and also the politics behind that in a moment. We have calls for our two guests on the No Child Left Behind Act, the law that was signed into law in 2002. It's part of our landmark legislative series. We'll go to Anthony in Detroit, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, I went to a public school while No Child Left Behind was in effect, and it just seemed like it was way too many standardized tests. Just be, obvious about that. Obviously, they disemphasized arts and extracurriculars and just tried to push this, science, technology, math. But then they also say for English, they tried to just standardize and teach everyone how to write a 5-paragraph essay. They didn't teach, not everything you're going to write is going to be a 5-paragraph essay. So, I understand they were trying to establish some measurable objectives for achievement, but we had limited English proficiency in our president who signed this law, so I don't think how he could improve our English proficiency for the students.
Rick Cass, you would like to respond to that?
Sure. Carolyn touched on this. It's a great point. One thing that happens is when you set targets in complex areas, it's called Campbell's Law, but what happens is you tend to distort behavior. So, for instance, if you tell school districts that you will be judged as making adequate yearly progress or not based only on reading and math scores, we saw school districts shifting time away from other activities, away from civics, away from the arts, away from recess, and giving kids more reading and math. And today, you actually still see these fights playing out. You also saw this because the focus was on getting kids to proficiency. You saw districts shifting away from a focus on, say, things like gifted programs or advanced instruction and moving into making sure they were getting kids over the bar. So one big problem when not the X-ray that we've talked about with NCLB, I think, I think was important and essential. And I think it sounds to me like Carolyn's saying something very similar. But when we linked it up to some of these efforts to try to say this is how you improve schools, you create real problems. And, I think part of the distrust that you see in the public when it comes to school testing today is exactly what the caller, I think, wisely identified. People will point out that No Child Left Behind itself only really required kids to take one test a year in the spring. It wasn't a big deal.
No, that's for people who could get around.
So fixated.
Wait.
Because how kids did.
You see how people were getting around the requirements of the law. And No Child Left Behind required that when you take the Title I money, it's 30, 60, 90 days into the school year that you have to redo your single plan for student achievement. See, people just got away with what the least that they could get away with. And they're talking about rolling it back. Yeah, rolling it back because those requirements never went away. All of them still are there. So we're going to see how they fare because really, they're not going to be able to pretend that they don't have the obligation to give everyone the same opportunity. So let's just keep on listening because this is today.
On that test was the measure of whether your school was going to be identified as a good school or a bad school. Schools really ramped up all of the other testing they were doing during the year to make sure the kids were ready for that test, to identify which kids weren't over the bar yet. And so what happened, and we saw this by about 2013, 2014, even the Obama White House at that point was sharing data from the Council of Great City School Districts, pointing out just the extraordinary amount of testing that had grown up around what was supposed to be just a once-a-year assessment.
Let's go to Carl in Charlottesville, Virginia.
No, what it required is The states and local school district know exactly where they are, regardless if they were just reporting once a year. They'd have real data, something that they could, lean to. Who wants a child who, you have to understand they're pushing these kids out of public school without any basic knowledge. And that's unacceptable because we've been paying taxes our whole lives. So yes, guess what? I get to speak on it. Why? Because I understand what's happening. And you need to too, but it's your choice, of course. Someone said, oh, stop sending me this mess. And I said, gladly, block people. I don't have time to be trying to convince people that this is critical. This is urgent mass. It's time for us to all wake up. So let's just finish listening. Washington Journal. It was July 31st, 2022. That's today.
Yeah, good morning.
Hello. Love that you're addressing this issue. I was born in 1998, graduated in 17. So this was my life in Pennsylvania. And you make a great point. I didn't even know that it was supposed to be one test because when it came to being PA was we had the PSSAs, which were like elementary school, and they were actually developed, written by Pearson, located in New Jersey. So yeah, that whole thing. And then we had the Keystones, which were given to us in high school. So it is this kind of runaway testing. And we felt like there was almost a revolution every year. What are we going to have this year? What tests are we going to have to take this year? And it really got crazy. You made a good point also about gifted education. I was gifted. I went up through that program. That kind of fizzled out in high school. Just from a student perspective, this was an incredibly confusing, stressful too, because we knew, oh man, we're gonna have to take all these tests, and they took a while. They were long exams, so I guess my question is, because I've been out of the system now for 5 years, where does it stand today? Are students taking as many tests in these states that really went whole hog with it, like PA? Or have they abated, whether through purpose or because they just don't have the money?
Great question. Carol Heinrich, your thoughts on that?
Sure. What you're both pointing out is this focus on all this benchmark testing. In fact, if you were one of those kids who was closer to, needed to get over the bar to be proficient, you may have been subjected even more testing than your peers. I mentioned I was in Texas, and so there has been, I think, some pulling back on the excessive additional testing. At the time, my kids were in high school, and they had 14 to 15 different tests they took each year in addition to that, and the benchmark testing. And there was actually legislation that happened that Rick Perry signed to ratchet that back down to 5 tests. So there was, even under that time of No Child Left Behind, there was some pulling back of that, the extensive testing. And part of the reason it's been necessary to do so is teachers also. Right now we're looking at serious teacher shortages, and teachers were also pushing back because it was affecting, I think, as you pointed out, what would be taught in the classroom, how much time would be spent in the classroom on learning versus testing. And I even, my students even had the experience of time spent in class teaching them how to, if they didn't know the answer to a question, what would be the best approach to guessing that answer on those standardized tests. So from parents and students' perspective, that's not really how they want to spend the time in the classroom. That's not what teachers wanted to be doing either.
And Rick, with those kinds of stories that she's talking about, that really set the scene for the repeal of some of NCLB in the Every Student Succeeds Act?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In fact, if some of the viewers may recall, there was a huge fight about 8 or 9 years ago for around the Common Core state standard. Right. The Common Core was actually kind of the stepchild of No Child Left Behind, because what No Child Left Behind did was it said to states, we're not going to tell you what standards to adopt. We're not going to tell you what passing is. We're just telling you you have to have standards and have to then grade school. So if you were a governor, there was a big incentive to choose to set easier standards and to set a low bar and to kick the can because you didn't have to be at 100% till 2014. And so what happened was you saw a lot of states opted for the politically more attractive course of setting a bar where they could say lots of our kids are doing well. And there was a lot of skepticism in the ed reform world among folks like Ted Kennedy and George Miller, who said this was not what we intended. And so the push for the Common Core was the idea that states should adopt common standards, the same standards in reading and math. And then that way schools would be on a level playing field. Now, once you get there, the whole genius of the No Child Left Behind design was every state was allowed to go its own way. Once you get into Common Core, you've got to choose what's the right way to teach math, what's going to belong in those recommended readings, how much fiction or nonfiction. And so this all blew up into a national fight where you had folks on the left who were worried about too much testing and being too intrusive with teachers and, what they called neo-corporate efforts to write curricula. On the right, you had people who were lashing out against, big foundations on the West Coast and politicians on the, in DC, trying to dictate to their schools and trying to interfere with their routines. And so that really created a backdrop. They had a firestorm of pushback against both testing and standards. And that's really what gave rise to the push for the Every Student Succeeds Act.
The Every Student Succeeds Act, signed by President Obama in 2015, it made continued annual standardized testing with accountability shifted to the states. The states now take on the consequences of those low-performing schools. Under that law, it required a 5-indicator accountability: reading and math achievement, English proficiency, high school graduation rates, and a 5th, the choice of the state. And it sets new standards for students with disabilities. Let's hear from Evie, who's in Albany, Georgia, who's a teacher trainer. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. This is such a timely topic, especially because August, of course, in another couple of weeks begins the new school year for teachers and students. The impact, of course, is the reckoning that we're having right now of the 2002 law of No Child Left Behind. And as you just stated, President Obama came in with Secretary Duncan and then created the impetus of trying to, I think, bridge the gap of a movement to try to abate the decline in proficiencies.
That's
but
right.
I think the larger point to this for us as a society.
But what Obama did do is he ended the waiver. And so there's no more waivers. And for Nevada, who's trying to get the waivers are not coming. So let's just all understand this accountability system that was established under No Child Left Behind, which was George Bush, G.W. Bush. That's exactly who did it, George W. Bush.
For right now having 30 to 40% of teachers, 1st to 5-year teachers in the system who are not going to be coming back. We are in a crisis right now with regard to teacher education and retainment of teachers. And in due part to the fact that I think we've lost the value and the foundational construct of this is a profession. Most of our teachers right now, Georgia, Florida, particularly Georgia, paying $39,000 for entry-level teachers who must, in fact, be board certified and even masters. Really, in true form, teachers are not able to come to the classroom with just BA degrees. That is not the profession that we have. We have a very highly educated profession. Here, talking about the charter and choice, that really was a part, I think, of this No Child Left Behind. If we talk about the construct of this, we're really talking about an ideology whereby we were using, it seems, reform, the word reform and standards and Common Core, that actually was about changing the public school fundamental investment, where Title I, as the lady said, those funds were initially, you cannot sustain taking money from Title I programs, but to get to the larger point, and the question is this: we are right now facing a situation where in 1991, I think it was Minnesota that became the first state that legalized the so-called reform, which was the word charter schools that came about. The LA board, the largest second district in the nation, has moratorium.
And Evie, what is your question for our guests?
Okay, the question is this: how do you see that the new construct where parents now, most of our children, 90% of children are in the public school system. We've got 6 to 10% in something that's charter or voucher or opportunity scholarships. And these things still do not create the closure that we're talking about.
I think you've given us enough there. Carolyn Heinrich, if you'd like to respond.
So there was a lot in your many points that you made about kind of where we are today. And I think, the one, thing I heard come through in multiple ways is the concern about resources for really serving our public school students well. And, in Tennessee, we're having, where I am today, we're having a pretty big debate about the governor's plan to push more charter schools and having vouchers. And, it's a complicated, very complicated debate. But the big concern is whether or not in the way that is implemented, does that take resources away from the public schools where, as you pointed out, 90% of the kids are educated? I think that's the big fear. And, I think the one thing that, so Every Student Succeeds Act tried to broaden a bit how we thought about accountability, right? Taking a little bit off the narrow focus on just the reading and math test scores. But, we're still in a situation where I believe, and I've worked with a number of these school districts where, many of the school districts rely heavily on those Title I funds to effectively serve their students. And I've seen, school districts working very, very hard to do very best for their students, being continually constrained by inadequate resources. For example, we might work with them in interventions where we identify them as effective and the school district wants to keep implementing it, but they find that they're short in their budget and they can't continue those programs. So I think the one thing I heard from you is that we don't have adequate resources. We're not paying teachers well enough for them to commit to a profession where they feel all of these pressures. And the pressures, increased tremendously with the pandemic and all the challenges we faced and all the concerns we have now about more students having fallen behind in their education. So, I don't know if I exactly got to what your question was, but that's one of the things I hear, that without more resources for implementing effectively these, reforms of various types, or ensuring that our public schools have adequate resources to serve the many students who have even greater need now, we are not going to achieve what we'd like to achieve, as encouraged by the Every Student Succeeds Act.
It's our landmark legislation series here on Washington Journal. We're focusing this morning on the No Child Left Behind law, signed into law in 2002. Don is up next in Miami, Florida. Go ahead.
Good morning. In the teaching field, we refer to this program as NCLB. And as I already mentioned, with the increase in testing, the sad part is that it wasn't used as a learning tool or opportunity. Mm-hmm. Instead, it was used as a punishment. Teachers' salaries depended on the test. Schools were graded on the test. So teachers, they taught to the test. The irony is that the pedagogical thinking that was beginning to emerge at the time was student-directed learning with teacher guidance and not teaching by fear. The testing was beneficial financially beneficial to Jeb and George's brother, by the way, who was in the testing business. And two more observations. The program was supposed to increase science teachers' salaries. It did not. And it also promoted bringing in foreign teachers to supplement the teaching population here in the United States. With the standards changes that occurred every year by the Florida Republican legislature during NCLB, gave me a summer job every summer rewriting curriculum for the school district. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Don. Rick Hess, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the listener has some really good points. I mean, for instance, this tinkering with curricula always happens. I mean, back before there was ever No Child Left Behind, my first book, it was Brookings back in the 90s, called Spinning Wheels, because there is this endless churn that comes around the world of school reform and curriculum. But some of what the reader said, so what the viewer just shared, was absolutely deeply believed by a lot of people in education. It just wasn't true. There was nothing in No Child Left Behind that affected teacher salary. Now, what No Child Left Behind did, again, it tested kids. Those results were used to identify schools and school systems as making AYP or not making AYP. If you didn't make AYP, as Carolyn talked about, there was a cascade of remedies that after the 5th identification year, your school was supposed to be restructured. It was interesting when you talk with the people who ran state school district systems at the time. There were 4 definitions of restructuring. One of them was changing the principal of the school. The easiest trick that they used, which they made famous in California, was if you assigned the school a new PIN number in the state data system, it counted as a reset. And because they were so overwhelmed after a certain point by the number of schools that were identified as failing during the Schwarzenegger years, the Department of Ed wound up sometimes just changing PIN numbers.
So, you know, this is all because people have figured out how to get around the basic requirements because there's just not enough people holding them accountable. This is all, I mean, you know, he's not a genius. He's more like the Donald, figuring out how to get around the rules, but who does it screw? It screws us, the people.
Numbers, because they couldn't handle anymore. But teacher pay was not affected directly. Districts may have adopted some kind of bonus related to test scores, but there was nothing in the law that did this. There was nothing in the law that paid science teachers differently than other teachers. There was nothing in the law about hiring foreign teachers. But if you go back and you read, say, member communication from the National Education Association or the American Federation for Teachers at the time, you will see that some of this stuff got shared as if it was true. So one of the complications that really marked the debates around NCLB is NCLB did some things that were really good and valuable, giving us a window into how kids were doing that was important. Back in the late 80s, or the West Virginia psychologist looked at testing. It noted that every single state in the nation, all 50 states, reported that their average student was above average nationally because they were using these funky tests that scores tended to inflate over time. So that transparency was valuable. There were a lot of problems involved, but when we tried to debate what was working and what wasn't working among teachers, among parents, among folks out there, there was such an interesting mix of
disagreement,
confusion, and fake news and the rest of it, that it became very difficult. And so you saw some of the law's biggest champions, like Bush Secretary of Education Margaret Spelling, would sometimes just get so frustrated that some of what they were responding to was inaccurate, that it was really hard to have constructive debates, and people really retreated to their corners. You were for the law or against it. And if you were against it, you thought it was a conspiracy to make the Bush family rich. And if you were for it, you thought you were fighting the unions. And you still see a lot of that same divide very evident in education debates even today.
Carolyn Heinrich, the whole focus on STEM curriculum, the science, technology, engineering, and math, come out of the NCLB?
No. So it didn't. And it's interesting, too, that the viewer had mentioned, for instance, student-centered learning. Going back forever, there have been these debates about how directed should a teacher be, and you see the same thing with STEM, going back, say, to the launch of Sputnik by the Soviets in the late 50s, and the National Defense Education Act of 58. We have had federal efforts to support STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math programming, because it's understood that it's important for the national interest. So we have engineers and students who are accomplished in that. So it's fair. The viewer is very fair to point out that there have been federal efforts to promote STEM learning, but that was not in any way a significant part of NCLB in particular.
All right, let's go to Paul in New York City. Go ahead. Paul, New York City on the line. Go ahead.
Good morning, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Just make sure you mute your volume. Go ahead with it. Yes, we can. Mute your volume, Paul, and go ahead with your comments.
Okay. Well, I turned it off, so
Okay,
so
good.
it's more than muted. So
Great.
here's my question. We spend more in the U.S. We spend more in the U.S. than most OECD countries per student. The results under the PISA test, the international test, is that we do very poorly. In New York, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, and his school chancellor have called out that there's been a massive increase in spending per student in New York City, adjusted for inflation, pre-COVID, and the results have been very poor. And when we talk about STEM, the reason why STEM is being stressed, I think, is because it provides better opportunity, which is what the whole purpose of education is supposed to be. It's supposed to be give people better lives. It's not supposed to be like some stepping stone to go to college and go through a whole bunch of trouble so that you can get a college degree and work as a barista. So I guess my question is, what do you think the answer is? Why are we spending so much more? I heard one of your speakers say that there was an issue of resources. Well, if it's an issue of funding, in many northeastern districts, northeastern United States districts, the spending can be quite high and the results can be quite poor.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what is going on? It's almost like healthcare, where we spend more per capita and get less. It seems to be a trend in this country.
Okay, Carolyn Heinrich, would you like to respond to that?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a complicated question because, as we know, just having a certain number of dollars per student isn't going to necessarily, depending on how that money is spent. There's research, for example, showing that spending on infrastructure, which is what many people think about, building, schools with more more up-to-date technology, resources, adding on infrastructure spending isn't really well correlated with, what happens in terms of student achievement. And, my experience working with, as I was mentioning, some districts where they're constantly feeling short of what they need to do. And one of the things we also know is that, for example, pension commitments made a long time ago. When you think about the actual cost of a teacher, it's not just the teacher's salary, it's all the benefits. And some of those commitments that were made many years ago are eating up more and more of a school district's budget each year, leaving them with less to spend, in particular on things that we think would increase student learning or provide, or for example, like we said, if there are places where teacher salaries are still pretty low, how can we keep the great science teacher who's, a high school science teacher from going to the private sector because he can make so much more money there. So, it's a complicated question. There's different research also is not, overwhelmingly consistent on whether or not school spending really does lead to improvements in student achievement. So it's a good question to ask. I don't have the specific answer for what's happening in New York, but I do know that there are, and we're also asking, these days we're asking schools to do more than just, bring students to their desks and teach them. We have a range of services that we're providing for students that they don't necessarily get in their community. For example, we have school-based health centers, and we have all kinds of things that we're dealing with to help students learn, to help them healthy, to be learning, breakfast programs, lunch programs, after school programming, things we do. So I would say that might be part of the explanation for why we still, even as we spend more, we still find ourselves short on resources. And it really, from district to district, the number of students you have needing many more of those types of extra services varies.
Next up is Mike in Berea, Ohio. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I think we did not mention on the teacher side how No Child Left Behind absolutely destroyed teachers. And what I mean by that is the scores were attached to teacher evaluation. So if you were a teacher and you did not meet a certain standard, now you're a developing teacher or you are a poor teacher. And then after so many years, they would fire you. I have seen teachers absolutely destroyed by a test score, and they gave it their all. Gave it their all. You cannot make students learn. You cannot legislate learning in the home. And it was a mass exodus of teachers. And that, from the teacher's point of view, and as far as charter schools are concerned, A lot of people believe that, students go to a charter school, okay, it's going to fix everything, okay? The charter school mirrors the local school. So if the local school have a certain standard there and they're not performing, 9 times out of 10, the charter schools is going to reflect that school because it's the same kids and the same parents.
And Rick asked, we have more charter schools in the country here 20 years past the signing of No Child Left Behind?
Yeah, so on charters, previous caller mentioned it right. Minnesota passed the first charter law in 91. For viewers who aren't sure what charter is real simple. Usually in this country, the local school board runs the local school. What a charter said was that a state legislature passed a law saying that other people would perhaps be able to open schools in the state depending if the legislature gave an authority. In some states, they've given the authority to universities. In other states, to a particular charter board. It depends. There's about 7,000 charter schools today, serving about 3 million kids. So that's about 6% of American students. On the teacher evaluation point the caller made, I mean, it's fascinating because I think he's exactly right. Interesting thing though, was that wasn't No Child Left Behind. What happened was we talked at the beginning of the show about this era of kind of the school reform consensus that emerged from, say, the Clinton years through the Bush and Obama years. In 2009, as part of the Recovery and Reinvestment Act during the Great Recession, there was a program called Race to the Top that President Obama, that Congress enacted. It gave about $5 billion for 2 programs, Investing in Innovation Fund and this Race to the Top. And the Race to the Top rewarded states for doing things, including teacher evaluation. So what happened was the tests that had been created in response to No Child Left Behind, you could use those scores for teachers in grades 3 through 8, really 4 through 8. You didn't need specifically, to look at how much of a gain those teachers' kids had on reading or math relative to other teachers. And so what the Obama administration did to Race to the Top, and then through those waivers from No Child Left Behind, Carolyn had mentioned, was push states to adopt programs in which teachers were rated in part on those movements in student test scores. And as the caller mentioned, there's all kinds of issues that can arise when teachers start getting graded narrowly in reading or math scores. It was a very complicated debate, but absolutely in the teaching ranks, it very much felt like this was being done as an attack on teachers. Although when you talk to the people who were most excited about it, they saw it as a chance to more objectively and fairly evaluate teachers who were good at their work. All of this stuff we're talking about was really what contributed to that Every Student Succeeds Act, which would be, and we could talk about that if that's useful.
Let's hear from Rachel in Vashon, Washington State. Good morning.
This may seem like a detour, but ultimately it's all connected. What do you think of what Bernie Sanders had to say about college for all and canceling student debt? Because those parents are the ones taking care of those kids. Those parents, in order to be able to afford to live somewhere decent, have their kid in a decent school, et cetera, they have to have a profession. They have to be doing something besides working at the local grocery store, unless the other half of the family makes enough money that it's worth it. That should have made sense, but I've had brain surgery.
Either of you want to respond to that? All right, I'll move on to the next call. We'll go to Judy, who's in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I have a comment, more so than a question. Anyway, it's in reference to the George Bush Jr. Slogan about education, No Child Left Behind law that was setting people up, young people, for failure. And now we are dealing with those students. And this came in, it filtered into Obama after he left George Bush. And after that time, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can. Yeah.
Oh, and he, I think he has 2 children himself, one college, and both college, one may have finished by now, and a large sign near our Capitol one of the poorest active middle schools there in Washington, D.C., still use that slogan, leave no child behind. My question and concern, and I was listening to Mrs. Hiss and Mr. I may have it mixed up here because I've been doing so much.
Rick Hess and Carolyn Heinrich, Rick, go ahead.
That was a good method of leave no child behind for what we call leadership in education. I worked in Guilford County there in North Carolina. Now I'm traveling, and you setting up students leave no child behind failure. You said, well, why are they doing that? First thing, all children do not learn on the same level. And I was working with high school students. Some were 18 years old in 10th, 11th, or 12th grade, and they could not read. They could not do math. So I'm looking to also work with kindergarten through middle school.
Okay, Judy, thanks for the call. And Carolyn Heinrich, how soon after the passage, once the law took place, did you really start to notice there were issues with the law that needed to be worked out?
There's zero accountability.
Well, it did take a few years. As Rick mentioned, states had to figure out their own, ways that they were going to establish their minimum standards in relation to the proficiency requirements. But it didn't take very long. A couple years into it is, again, you had to have under the laws.
But what he said, what George Bush said was, in a state, if the people were satisfied and not asking for the federal government to come in and support them, then the federal government would never get involved. I filed a complaint against Nevada. It was accepted and then it was shut down. And I was told that I could no longer advocate for the data in regards to the children who would have gone through the harbor. And where are they? And what happened? And are they in juvenile hall? Or the people who are locked up in the Haven, because we don't even know what the Haven is. It's all those children in foster care. We can't assess their services. And so because we can't assess anything, we have no data. It's a problem.
The first system had to be in place. And then before those consequences started coming in, there had to be 3 years where a school did not make adequate, or the students in school did not make adequate yearly progress. So I would say, as we started to look around 2006 and 7 in that time, that's where we started to see more and more and more schools start coming. So that by around, like 2009 and 10, that's where the crisis was really hitting, where there were so many students not making adequate yearly progress under these increasingly challenging standards to meet. And that's also where, as we talked about already, where again, I think schools, systems, educators within them started really feeling this pressure. We heard from callers talking about how they, repeatedly tested. And, this last point that was made about, were we doing better and not leaving some children behind? We may have been better measuring where students were, but there was also shown in some of the research that where the focus really ended up being when those kids were close to passing the standards, right? Just getting them over the bar, and less attention to the kids who were really far behind. And as was also mentioned, the kids who were well over the bar, right? So there was some perversion of that, and we recognize that. And I think that's where, as became many more children became affected, that's where the system became unsustainable.
It's interesting, as we talked today, a headline in the opinion page of the New York Times this morning, an opinion piece, "The movement to end homework is wrong. The debates over education obviously continue." Let me give you each less than a minute or so to wrap this up and where you would like to see federal education policy go next. Rick Hess, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think, Washington has an important role. We've got 50 states. If every state is using different tests and there's no framework for comparability, it's hard for voters or parents to really hold their leaders in their state accountable. So I think the kind of framework that No Child Left Behind created around regular assessment and regular subjects at certain grades made a ton of sense. I thought Every Student Succeeds Act did a terrific job of keeping the parts that work best, that testing framework, and walking away from this effort from Washington to dictate school improvement to 14,000 school districts or 100,000 schools. I think there's an enormously important federal role for investing in the kind of research that Carolyn alluded to. This is what Washington does, because it doesn't make sense to do that state by state. It's a collective good. I also think there's an important federal role, obviously, in protecting civil rights. This is part of the historic federal role. Where I think Washington is not at its best and often gets in the way is when it starts trying to talk to states and school leaders about the right ways to improve schooling, because I think that depends so much on context, on resources, on kids.
No,
that
it depends on civil rights.
For a federal bureaucracy to actually play a productive role.
And Carolyn, your brief thoughts on the same question.
Sure. I agree with literally all of what Rick just said, but I would also add that, this importance of the regular assessment, and this was actually mentioned by a viewer, let's look at how we can constructively use that information. When it's used as a stick or used to, grade schools and label schools, A, B, C, D, or F, it's not really effective. And it really does, it's set up for, polarizing groups who I think all agree that what we most care about is whether or not students are learning. So, we now have more responsibility at the state level for the accountability policies implementation. We can use that rich variation with that information that we're collecting in regular assessments to really better understand what is working and how we can move more towards the goal we share. And that is really seeing children learn more and succeed when they leave schools and the labor market.
It was indeed landmark legislation, the No Child Left Behind law. We've been talking about it with Carolyn Heinrich, who is professor at Vanderbilt's Peabody College in Nashville, and Rick Hess, Education Policy Studies Director at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
That will do it for this morning's Washington Journal. We are back tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, and we hope you are too. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
That was the Washington Journal. That was the Washington Journal. And it comes on every day. And it's excellent for people to understand just what No Child Left Behind and how this all started, because there's IDEA 2004. There's just legislative laws on the books. And failure is just not an option. So the word is prohibition. By many, there's one, but out of one, there just may be none. And what are you willing to do in 2022? Like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on Anchor, which is Parent Empowerment Hour. Or you could just follow me on YouTube, Darlene Edison 1958. Hey, wake up in America. I felt that was so critical so that we can learn